Redfall, one of the most tragic game releases of 2023 and almost the worst major high-profile game launch of this year until Golem swooped in and said, hey, hold my ring. Looking at the Metascore right now on Xbox Series X, the aggregate score from 68 critic reviews is sitting at 56%, and the user score is sitting at a mere 3.5. On PC, the Metascore is at a 54%, and the user score is at a 2.1. On Steam, the user review score is sitting at a 32%, mostly negative, which makes it one of the worst user-reviewed games of all time on Steam, sitting somewhere in the top 20s. And then in terms of its player base, there is no better indication of a dead live service than when player numbers plummet to this degree, where already we're sitting in the low triple digits. And for good measure, on OpenCritic, we can see a critic average score of 58%, with only 14% of critics recommending this game. Every facet of this game was lackluster, from its story to its open world to its level, activity, and mission design, the hero abilities, the encounter designs, the implementation of multiplayer, loot, all further exacerbated by baffling technical issues, bugs, glitches, frame rate stutters, performance woes, awful AI, you name it. Following the game's disastrous launch, many people wondered what the hell happened with this game. How could Arcane have shipped such a travesty, especially after launches like Prey and Dishonored, you name it. They know how to make good games. How did something like Redfall come out? Well, here to answer that question is none other than investigative reporter Jason Schreier, who published the following article on Bloomberg that exposes a disastrous development process further marred by piss-poor leadership, a lack of direction. All of that is reported in an article titled Inside the Making of Redfall, Xbox's Latest Misfire. After Microsoft paid $7.5 billion for its parent company, Arcane Studios' Redfall has been blasted by critics and players alike. The basic summary of this situation is that the project suffered from unclear direction, frequent attrition, and a perennial lack of staff, according to more than a dozen people who worked on the game and spoke out to Jason Schreier because obviously they felt like this story needed to get out there. A lot of people tend to think of game development studios as this singular entity when it is a complex machine with hierarchies of people, and oftentimes it's leadership who tends to steer the ship wrong into an iceberg, and the crew suffers for it when the crew's just following the captain trying to do their job. There's clearly talent at Arcane, but when leadership doesn't know how to utilize that talent, you get results like Redfall. The article begins by highlighting that Redfall's development began in 2018, so this game was roughly 5 years in development. ZeniMax behind the scenes was encouraging its studios to develop games that could generate revenue, aka games as a service, and you can tell that Redfall started as a live service game given the shoehorned looter elements. The final game didn't ship with microtransactions, but the framework felt like this was originally a live service, which is a major contributor to why this game just feels so utterly disjointed. Lo and behold, ZeniMax was strongly urging developers at its subsidiaries to implement microtransactions. And it was this major push on the part of parent company ZeniMax for live services and monetized games that led other franchises like Fallout, Doom, and Wolfenstein releasing with versions incorporating online multiplayer and monetization options. It's the reason why we got Fallout 76 and why that game turned out the way it did. And yes, it got better over time, but that launch period, and not just the first couple months, the first couple years of that game were incredibly rough, which goes to highlight how corporate mandates can utterly devastate a video game project, its creative ambitions, its potential, how these mandates can severely compromise a game development studio's ability to do its best work and a studio's ability to lean on its strengths. And it's one thing if a studio wants to shift genres or try something different of their own volition, but when they're suddenly making live services, a genre they're not used to making because of corporate mandates, then you're shoehorning them into a genre that they're not specialized in, nor that they want to really make. Arcane is not a live service game development studio. They specialize in immersive sims, and Arcane just tried to chase trends under the leadership of Harvey Smith and Ricardo Behr, who were respected industry veterans, and it's these two who were tasked with steering the Redfall ship to serve as co-directors of Redfall following the commercially unsuccessful release of its sci-fi shooter Prey a year earlier, a fantastic game that unfortunately just didn't sell all that well. Leadership across the company wanted to make something more broadly appealing. What eventually emerged was the idea to make a multiplayer game in which users would team up to battle vampires and perhaps pay for occasional cosmetic upgrades. This was an idea that leadership introduced that staff members were immediately apprehensive about. Some team members said they found this whole concept of a multiplayer arcane game confusing because they weren't sure that the type of gameplay that Arcane specialized in would meld well with a multiplayer type of environment. And it didn't help matters that while the two co-directors were very enthusiastic about this idea, they failed to provide clear direction. Staff members said that they grew frustrated with management's frequently shifting references to other games such as Far Cry and Borderlands that left each department with varying ideas of what exactly they were making. Even though Far Cry and Borderlands feature open world sandboxes, their focus and aspects of their gameplay philosophies are different. So when you're telling different departments, different games to chase after, you get something really disjointed. Not to mention that if you're constantly telling your team, basically make this game, then are you really making something that's unique? Are you really making something that stands out on its own? Or are you just chasing a trend and ending up making a worse version of something that has already established itself in that trend? This kind of mindless, knee-jerk reaction, trend-chasing habit is something that has led many video game projects astray. Speaking of habits, you know who will help you break excessive, unhealthy habits? The sponsor of today's video, Fume. This is an innovative, award-nominated device that takes all of the bad elements out of addictive habits involving inhalation of unhealthy chemicals and retains the fun actions of the habit alongside delicious, naturally flavored air. There are no vapors involved here, just breathe in and taste a wonderfully refreshing scent. I got 3 flavors with me here, and the one I tried was white cranberry, which genuinely smells and tastes amazing. The second I opened the package, I immediately got a whiff of what I can best describe as a zesty, slightly minty, almost tea-like smell that took me by surprise in the best way and filled the room. Inserting the flavored corn to the device was super quick and simple, and once I took a hit, the aroma immediately filled my mouth and nose in the most pleasant way. There was no coughing, no irritation. It's just air that smelled and tasted really freaking good and really freaking fresh. The device itself feels very premium with its combination of high-quality wood and metal, with magnets holding them together, and the metal part itself rotates to adjust the amount of airflow, and it's also a great way for fidgeters to keep their fingers busy. Switching from bad habits to Fume is easy, enjoyable, and even fun, which is why over 100,000 customers have made the change with thousands of success stories, and there's no reason you can't be one of them. If breaking destructive habits is up your alley, you can pick up the Journey Pack today by heading to tryfume.com/yongyeah or scanning the QR code and use the code YONGYEAH to get 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com and use the code YONGYEAH to save an additional 10% off on your order today. Many game publishers could use a Fume equivalent because they are excessively addicted to the unhealthy trend of trend chasing, which leads to projects that lack identity or have clashing identities. In the case of Redfall, there was a fundamental tension between single-player and multiplayer design that remained unsolved throughout the development of this game. And then there's the staffing issue. The fact that Arcane Austin decided to take on a live service when they staffed less than 100 people is just utterly baffling. Competing game studios that work on successful live services like Fortnite and Destiny, they house hundreds of employees. That's just how many people it takes to make a live service and to maintain it consistently over the long term. Developers at Arcane were also just not motivated to make this game. Morale at Arcane suffered. Veteran workers who weren't interested in developing a multiplayer game left in droves. By the end of Redfall's development, roughly 70% of the Austin staff who had worked on Prey would no longer be at the company. It's important to understand that part of why developers apply for certain companies is because they want to work on specific types of games. And so when that development studio suddenly shifts course to a genre that they not only don't specialize in, but it's just kind of typical trend chasing and not establishing anything new that finds a way to make that genre fresh all over again, employees are just not going to be motivated to stay. Developers are going to want to look for greener pastures. And that goes doubly true when they sense piss poor leadership that's going to lead to a disastrous development cycle that will ultimately result in a disastrous product, which is exactly what happened with Redfall. As developers left Arcane, the studio had trouble filling those vacancies because not only did ZeniMax have a reputation for paying lower than average salaries, a lot of people were applying to Arcane by and large because they wanted to work on single-player immersive sims, and so unsurprisingly, applications for the multiplayer side of things were just few and far between, because that's just not what Arcane is known for, nor what people would want to apply to Arcane for. And it didn't help that because Redfall hadn't been announced when they needed to hire people, the studio couldn't describe its details to prospective employees. The games industry also has an excessive habit of secrecy to the point where it's to the industry's detriment. 2 years into the development of Redfall in 2020, Microsoft purchased ZeniMax for $7.5 billion. And at that point, staff members working on Redfall who could see the writing on the wall surrounding this game were hoping that Microsoft would step in to either cancel Redfall or let them reboot it as a single-player game. But Microsoft maintained a hands-off approach and gave ZeniMax plenty of autonomy. Think about this. Ground floor developers knew 2 years into the development of Redfall that this project would bomb, and they were praying that the game that they were working on would get canceled. By now, someone even higher up the chain than ZeniMax leadership, Microsoft leadership, they were desperately hoping that this game would not see the light of day, much like vampires, ironically. But instead, Microsoft doubled down on Redfall. In fact, during their 2021 Summer Game Fest press conference, they made Redfall the show-stopping finale. The last trailer that they showed during the event, the one more thing, was that Redfall CGI trailer that was woefully unrepresentative of the final game. As development of this game continued, as Arcane continued to be short on staff, stretched thin, eventually the team realized that they needed to push the release date of the game back, and so the game was delayed from Halloween of 2022 to early 2023, and then eventually to May 2nd, 2023. And even with multiple delays, it was apparent that there was no way Redfall was going to have enough time to be made into a good game. Frankly, the foundation, the blueprint of the game was extremely flawed because it lacked so much direction, because it tried to initially shoehorn in microtransactions and live service elements. It was a disjointed idea to begin with, but Smith and other leaders assured the staff that the arcane magic would manifest at the last minute as it had with previous games. If that sounds familiar to you, that's the exact same mentality that BioWare used to ship Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem. Leadership had this egotistical notion that because they previously launched successful games, they didn't need to improve their development pipeline or their work culture. They could just write it out because at the end, things will coalesce and come together and we'll ship a great game because we are BioWare, or in this case, because we are Arcane and we got that magic. There's no such thing as magic. BioWare let the rot within their development process fester just because they barely pulled it off by the skin of their teeth with past releases before Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem. But that rot that they didn't address eventually came back to bite them in the ass with Andromeda's awful, disastrous launch and with Anthem's even worse launch. Arcane leadership seemingly didn't learn from BioWare's history and decided to repeat this notion of a magic within a certain studio. This notion of we're immune to bad products, to products falling apart mid-development, to shipping a product in a disastrous state. Just what kind of ego must you have to think that you can just write out bad management that eventually it won't come back to bite you in the ass, especially as you're tackling a live service, which is a different beast compared to your single-player experiences. I thought we were done with this kind of hubris, but apparently it still exists within certain studios, within certain leadership mindsets, and Redfall is yet another AAA project to fall prey to that kind of ego-driven mentality. The end result is that Redfall never coalesced. Several people who played the game in 2021 were shocked to see how little it ultimately changed. So what have they been doing these past 2 years? I guess they were mostly focused on trying to polish the game or just make it work on a basic level. Regardless, what we got was indeed a very disjointed feeling game, a game that tried to please both the single player and multiplayer crowd, but failed to ultimately please either. And a significant contributor to that disjointed feeling is that Redfall was intended to be a live service for the first 3 years of its development. Harvey Smith, one of the leaders, one of the co directors of Redfall, said that early on he pushed back against the compulsory inclusion of an in-game store, but developers who worked on the game say that that's a lie. Redfall actually had significant microtransactions plans in place for the first 3 years of its 5-year-long development cycle. It wasn't until just 2 years ago, in 2021, with games as a service growing more controversial among gamers, that Arcane finally scrapped its unwieldy in-game monetization plans. It was more than halfway into the game's development that they finally decided, we shouldn't make this a live service, we shouldn't include monetization and microtransactions. But guess what? By then it was too late, because so much of the foundation of the game had been built around this being a looter shooter live service, and it shows in the final game with how shoehorned the looter elements feel, how little it contributes to the overall game design. The game basically changed directions 2/3 of the way through, but that's an awful time to make such a major direction change. And so that's why you got a game that feels so half-baked, like it doesn't really know what it is, and like it has nothing unique to offer because it is so focused on chasing trends, be it live service trends or Far Cry-like trends. If you are going to chase a trend, your game has to excel in every area and surpass the games that are established and stand out in some way, either because of its quality or because of its unique ideas. Redfall does none of that, falls short on every level. Now, Microsoft did say recently that Arcane will continue working to improve Redfall. I think that's a terrible idea. Unless they're willing to dedicate No Man's Sky levels of manpower and resources into Redfall and willing to go that far when it comes to overhauling this game, there is no salvaging Redfall. Developers wanted it canceled way before it launched. I think developers, frankly, still want it canceled right now. They don't want to keep supporting this game that has failed and is doomed to continue to fail. I mean, look at the freaking player numbers right now. There is no recovering from this unless you do what No Man's Sky did and add so much new content and overhaul it so much that it basically feels like a different new game in the long term. Some patches and updates and bite-sized content releases, like that stuff's just futile. Might as well not waste more manpower, resources, and developers' time on something that I don't think has any chance of making a comeback. Redfall is just in too much of a piss-poor state. It's just too far gone. Might as well pull the plug on the poor thing. Just put it out of its misery. Or at least that's one man's take. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on all of this new information surrounding Redfall and what happened behind the scenes during the game's development and what you think the future holds for this game. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.